Hello, my name is Kara Taylor, Vice Mayor of the City of Placerville, and I'm here with Patty Borelli, Council Member. And we want to thank you for joining us for Placerville History Presentation. The purpose of this presentation is to tell the larger story of this city, a story that is rich and dynamic and so much bigger than any one event, a story that I believe we can all feel a connection to. I hope you enjoy this presentation, that you learn something new, and that it sparks new perspectives about the events from our past and our community's place in the history of California and this nation. During this presentation, 6 speakers will cover 6 different topics: the history of Native Americans in El Dorado County, the Gold Rush years, the incorporation and early days of Placerville, the 1900s, Placerville today, and the role of minority groups throughout Placerville's history.
With that, I'd like to express our thanks to the presenters who volunteered their time and energy to help us put together this presentation for you.
Our second speaker is Brendan Lindsay. Brendan Lindsay holds a PhD from UC Riverside and is an associate professor at the History Department of CSU Sacramento, where he teaches a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses on California history. His research focuses on California Indian genocide. His book, Murder State, California Native American Genocide, 1846 to 1873, received the Western Social Science Association President's Award for Best Book.
From Dry Diggins to Hangtown to Placerville, a presentation for the City of Placerville. I'm Brendan Lindsay, an Associate Professor of History at Sac State. I'm a specialist in 19th century California history with a research focus on the Gold Rush era and California Indian genocide. Today, as another presenter will be speaking on the history of Indigenous peoples in the region, I will be speaking instead on the research I performed looking at the earliest years of the community of Placerville. Nonetheless, I want to acknowledge that I live, work, and learn on the still unceded lands of the Indigenous peoples of California. I relied heavily on primary sources for this presentation. These are sources contemporary to events being studied. I mostly employed dozens of historical newspaper articles, especially from the 10 newspapers listed below. While sometimes biased, the facts obtained from these papers were solid, and the biases could be seen through by comparing stories in different newspapers. For example, the publishers of the Georgetown News hated Placerville, and so stories had to be taken with a grain of salt. I also used some Gold Rush letters collected by the American Antiquarian Society. I employed a few secondary sources as well, in this case meaning sources created by scholars, then peer-reviewed for quality and accuracy before they were published as scholarly books or articles. In the end, however, I brought my narrative together mostly from the primary sources. The Gold Rush began in 1848, but is mostly remembered as an 1849 phenomenon because most of the immigration came in that year and in the following year, 1850. Essentially, something on the order of 90,000 persons arrived in California, which had an infrastructure at that time, perhaps supporting 14,500 non-Indian people. As one might imagine, with 90,000 people showing up in about 12-month time frame, obtaining food, shelter, water, and other necessaries was a challenge. Communities sprang up and down the so-called mother lode in the Sierra Nevada foothills and mountains to meet this need. One such community forming was called Dry Diggins, formed late in 1848. Dry Diggins, the original place name for Placerville, bore this name from 1848 into early 1849. It was never incorporated as a city, which is not surprising since this was prior to statehood. It came to be settled by miners in 1848 because of 5 advantageous positions it occupied. It was at the nexus of 1, an east-west overland trail artery, 2, a roughly north-south trail that became known as the Coloma Road and later Route 49, 3, a westward trail down into the Central Valley to Sacramento that became known as the Hangtown Road, then the Placerville Road, and later is roughly approximated by the route Highway 50 occupies. 4, the site was at an elevation that received only modest snowfalls in the winter and allowed miners to come down out of the higher elevations in the winter snows and yet do some hard rock mining and dry digging as they waited out the harsh winter. Wintering in this location, regardless of the name the community had, became commonplace over the next decade's time and was a major source of income for businesses. And 5, there was a modest watercourse running through the community, Hangtown Creek, which was used for drinking, bathing, cooking, and washing gold if one was willing to carry the water in a bucket, dig a diversion ditch, or build a wooden sluice to then wash the soil away, leaving the gold behind. There was plenty of timber for doing the latter. Indeed, since the mining was done by digging dry earth, rather than panning in a stream flow, it was called a dry digging, hence the name of the location. However, this is not a great name choice, as dry diggings abounded throughout the Mother Lode region. Oftentimes in the sources, this settlement is referred to as dry diggins, lowercase d and lowercase d, even though it's meant to describe the community and should be capitalized. This is a source of great confusion. Hundreds of mentions are made of dry diggins all up and down the Mother Lode region, but few actually refer to this place. The name changed from dry diggins to Hangtown following the winter of 1849 lynching of 3 men that was widely reported and well remembered. An eyewitness account exists in the Journal of Edward Gould Buffum, who reported that 5 foreigners, none of whom spoke English, had been seized for the attempted robbery of a Mexican gambler, tried and convicted by a mob, and severely whipped as their punishment. 3 of the men whipped, 2 French nationals and 1 Chilean national, were believed to be wanted fugitives. They were then tried and found guilty of a previously committed robbery and attempted murder in the far-off southern reaches of the Mother Lode. They were sentenced to death, although none of the miners present were witnesses to these alleged crimes, and no evidence was presented against them beyond their fitting a general description. Buffum reported that the 3 had been so badly whipped after the earlier trial, they were not even present at the second trial. Nonetheless, they were bound, blindfolded, and hung until dead from an oak tree at the center of the community. While California was not a state yet, it did have laws and a military governor. The previous year in California newspapers, the military governor, Colonel Richard B. Mason, had issued a proclamation reminding the population of the laws as well as the continuance of local governance under the old alcalde system where it had existed. However, since the alcalde system of the Mexican era did not exist in the Sierra Nevada, and the U.S. Army rarely sent patrols into the Mother Lode for fear of desertions by troops catching gold fever, justice in mining camps was typically handled in an extra-legal manner, often simply referred to as Judge Lynch. Late in 1849, the first mentions of Hangtown as a place appeared in the newspapers as part of 2 different newspaper articles reporting on the mining prospects there. According to the Sacramento Daily Union, in October of 1850, an additional lynching occurred in what was now being called Hangtown. Richard Crone was lynched by a crowd after stabbing a man to death in the El Dorado Saloon. A newspaper account of the incident reported that the sheriff and town constables were prevented by the crowd from arresting him. Instead, the mob tried and executed Crone using the oak tree at the center of the town as a gallows. This was the sum total of lynching incidents discovered in the historical record, 4. In the records from the 1850s, there were a number of instances where the community considered lynching criminals, but in all cases, they turned them over to the proper authorities and to the legal system instead. These stories of swift vigilante justice did not keep people from wanting to come to Hangtown. According to newspaper reports, 5,000 persons wintered at Hangtown in January of 1850. Yet, as with dry diggins, The community was never incorporated. The community called Hangtown did not bear that name solely for long, perhaps by that name alone for only about 1 year. The California State Legislature recognized the community as Placerville and did not refer to it as Hangtown at the time of statehood. Similarly, in newspapers, the name was more often given as Placerville, not Hangtown, or sometimes as Placerville with Hangtown included in parentheses after it. As you can see on the slide, from the frequency count gathered from a historical newspaper database, the number of times Placerville was used to identify the community in newspaper articles versus the number of times Hangtown was employed in the period of 1849 to 1859 makes it clear that Placerville was always the more common name in usage, at least in printed sources. While I could not find confirmation in a reliable scholarly source, there were numerous unconfirmed examples of explanations for the change to Placerville, including being under pressure from local religious leaders, from members of a Methodist congregation, from members of a temperance society, and also an early failed public relations effort to attract the original county seat there at statehood. Instead, of course, it went to Coloma in 1850. Regardless, the community thrived between 1850 and 1854 under this dual identity. The community invested in its infrastructure and businesses open to take advantage of the location as previously covered. A post office was launched in 1850. Not long after, they built a bridge over Hangtown Creek. They attracted a stagecoach line to service a route between the town and Sacramento in 1850. By 1850, another stagecoach operation, as well as a wagon service, was hauling people the 6.5-hour trip down to Sacramento. Men opened timber businesses to supply lumber to miners, settlers, and business people. Placer mining continued, but also hard rock mining was begun. By 1853, hydraulic mining using gravity flow pressure was taking place. With a population of 5,000 in 1850, good lots in the town were hard to get. One source reported lots going for $2,000 a piece that year. How these lots were assigned was by community decree. Technically, everyone was a squatter, as the government had not officially opened public land for settlement. And since it continued to contain mineral deposits, it was unlikely the government would do that in the foreseeable future. Nevertheless, people claimed town lots, subdivided and sold them to one another, and the town flourished. In 1852, a new steam-powered sawmill had been built, and a large hotel and 5 storefronts on Main Street were reported as under construction. The crowding, limited water supply, and lack of infrastructure led to disease. Sometimes 5 to 6 people died per day in the town, and not all those who were buried in the cemetery received markers. Pestilences of flies and fleas were also reported as annual occurrences. Social and religious organizations sprang up immediately. Mentions of Methodist and Episcopalian churches, a temperance society, and a fraternal organization known as the Independent Order of the Grizzlies were all present by 1851. At a Christmas dinner hosted by the Loyal Order of the Grizzlies, one member offered this toast: "Here's to Hangtown, a bad place for criminals, but a great place for fun." Voluntary and political organizations existed as well. The town was strongly Democratic, and the community hosted various political meetings throughout the 1850s. The men in the community participated in campaigns against local Indian people. They formed volunteer fire companies, including the Neptune Hose Company and the Hope Hook and Ladder Company. Still, going into 1854, Placerville/Hangtown was not incorporated. Placerville sought and attained incorporation in May of 1854. One reason given was perhaps to help secure the property rights of those living in the town, legitimizing it by becoming an incorporated township. Another more explicit reason was for seeking incorporation in an effort to attract the El Dorado County seat there. They had been passed over at statehood in 1850. In late 1853, news spread in the region of a debate over the proposed move of the seat to either Placerville, Mud Springs, or Diamond Springs, or perhaps to leave it at Coloma. Petitions for and against the move appeared in 1854. Ultimately, after a contentious vote, the county seat remained at Coloma. In 1856, a similar process was revisited with the same result, but this time with even more acrimony and more charges leveled by all concerned of the wrongdoings and ballot box stuffing of everyone else. One newspaper charged that Placerville had been placing the ballot boxes in saloons and letting the whiskey flow. Nonetheless, the vote was to leave it at Coloma. The following year, 1857, the state legislature made the decision to relocate the county seat to Placerville, the supposition being that they believed wrongdoing by the opposition had been involved in Placerville's defeat. Sometimes mentions are made of Placerville either unincorporating or disbanding. I found no evidence of it becoming unincorporated, but I did find evidence of what was meant by disbanding. Placerville had made a bond issue to subsidize the construction of a railroad line up to the town coming through Folsom, referred to as the Sacramento and Placerville Railroad, or sometimes just the Placerville Railroad. The federal government had awarded the railroad public lands in and around Placerville. However, the railroad stopped the line short of Placerville, only going to Shingle Springs. The railroad demanded an additional $100,000 to complete the line. The community refused. The railroad simply then abandoned further construction. Meanwhile, the railroad bonds had been accumulating interest. They were held by an investor named Jackson R. Myers, who demanded his money now that the railroad was complete at Shingle Springs. These indeed seem to reflect the terms of the bonds. In 1873, when Myers attempted to have the officers of the county at Placerville served with papers forcing them to levy a tax on the county residents to repay the bonds with interest, he found that all the members had tendered their resignations and there was no one to serve the papers on. They had disbanded themselves, but there is no mention of unincorporating. As of 1874, the total debt amounted to $200,000. If the necessary taxes had been levied, property taxes would have nearly tripled in the county from 7 to 7.25% on every $100 of assessed property, or $7.25 for every $100 of assessed property. Evidence of the full resolution of this situation could not be found by me. However, the federal government did make the railroad forfeit the public land, which opened up room for additional settlement in the region. But how the Jackson Myers bond issue made out remains a mystery to me. One newspaper, however, claimed that, quote, Hangtown Creek will run with blood before the tax can be extorted from the people. So it seems somewhat unlikely he got all of his money, if any. I leave you with a list of the sources consulted for this presentation. For those interested in learning more about the early history of the Placerville region, I want to particularly recommend the California Digital Newspaper Collection, which is available free to the public and contains over 500,000 newspaper issues comprised of some 42.3 million newspaper articles, including, of course, some on dry diggings, Hangtown, and Placerville. Thank you for your time and attention.
Our next speaker is Dr. Nathan Hallam, an historian of the 19th and 20th century American West. At California State University, Sacramento, he teaches undergraduate courses in California history and a graduate course in historic preservation. Dr. Hallam also works as a private sector historical consultant and is currently assisting a team of city planners to develop a general plan update for the city of San Bernardino.
Hi, my name is Nathan Hallam, and my presentation is called Becoming Placerville. And so we start with the name change to Placerville in the early 1850s. I searched for the first instance of the name Placerville, and I found it in the statutes of California. And it is actually in the legal language that defined the county of El Dorado. This is from the first session of the California legislature in 1850 in San Jose. And one of the things they did was to divide California into 27 counties, including the county of El Dorado. And this is the legal language that created the county. And at the end here, we see the seat of justice shall be at Coloma or at Placerville, whichever place shall be chosen by the qualified electors of this county. The electors of the county chose Coloma in 1851, but what's interesting here is that the legislators are using the word Placerville in the first months of 1850 and not Hangtown. When we dig a little deeper into that legislative session, we see in the meeting minutes of the state senate that Mr. Tingley, that's George Tingley of Santa Clara, moved to amend section 17 as follows. So he's revising that legal language that created El Dorado County. He says, strike out the word Coloma and insert El Dorado. So he's changing the name of the county from Coloma County to El Dorado County. And then he also strikes out Hangtown and inserts Placerville. And so this is the moment when, at least officially, Hangtown becomes Placerville. And it's Tuesday, February 12th, 1850. Causes a little bit of confusion. This is from the Sacramento transcript in October 1850, Hangtown or Placerville. And we've got a newspaper correspondent in town, and he says that this place is called Hangtown from the fact that several persons were hung here last year for murder and robbery. It is known by that name among the immigrants for 500 miles back. The constant inquiry along the road is, how far is it to Hangtown? The legislature, however, has very properly changed the name to Placerville. So there is some disconnect between the state legislature, the elected officials who have made this place called Placerville, and the people on the ground who are participating in the gold rush and coming in from Nevada and asking, how far is it to Hangtown? So that indicates people that are participating in the gold rush call it Hangtown. But a year later, by 1851, we can look at this pocket map of the gold rush, the gold region of California, drawn by Benjamin Butler. And he's identifying this place as Placerville, and it becomes known amongst the miners increasingly as Placerville. We can see this a year later in the Sacramento Daily Union by 1852, the summer of 1852. We've got an advertisement here for the Hunter Express Company. And they're advertising their daily expresses, that is stagecoaches, to Coloma, to Placerville, or Hangtown, if you still call it that, Georgetown, Greenwood, Mormon Island, so on and so forth. So this, I think, indicates that most people know the place as Placerville in the summer of 1852. But just so there's no confusion, if you still call it Hangtown, it's in parentheses, or Hangtown. 1850s Placerville. So the California historian Thomas Hittell, 3-volume History of California in 1870, has this nice passage about the 1850s gold rush history of Placerville. The town, as it grew up after tents gave way to cabins and houses, so a little bit after 1849, it became a straggling collection of buildings along a ravine. It grew rapidly for a few years and was one of the briskest places in the mountains. As a sort of center in the midst of one of the richest regions of the country, it became a great place of resort for all the miners within 8 or 10 miles around, and especially on Sundays, they would flock in from every direction, some to get or dispatch letters, to meet friends or hear news, or to lay in new stocks of supplies, while of course others would seek the excitement of the bar room or the gaming table. And so this is the key phrase here, to lay in new stocks of supplies. That might mean buying tools or clothing or whatever it is you need back at the gold camp 8 to 10 miles away. It might also mean buying a wheelbarrow made by John Studebaker, who arrived in Placerville in 1853. And he took a job making wheelbarrows for a blacksmith in town. And after 5 years, he had made enough money to where he felt secure enough to leave California and join his brothers in South Bend, Indiana, and took with him about $8,000, which formed the basis of the Studebaker brothers' wagon making and carriage making business, which by the 1870s was the largest wagon making business in the world, and would go on to be the automobile company of the 20th century. This view of Placerville in 1856, it's a lithograph, and we've been staring at the centerpiece, but along the margins are these little pictures of buildings in town, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on in town. By 1853, all over California, we're finding efforts to create a civil society. The gold rush was a bit chaotic. It was overwhelmingly male. 9 out of every 10 participants were men, most of them in their 20s and 30s. And there was this get rich quick mentality. And you would then return home with all your wealth from California. So the idea was to get in, make as much money as possible, and get out and go back to where you came from. But by 1853, there's more of an effort by those who decided to stay in California to settle down, establish roots, develop businesses, acquire property, and if they can, raise families and establish relationships and institutions that form the basis of a civil society, as opposed to gold rush society, which is a little bit more chaotic. And the hangings, the vigilante justice in 1849, 1850 in Placerville, sort of a symbol of that chaos. And what Placerville is developing by 1856 is the rule of law and more of a family-friendly environment. We can see this in the buildings in town in 1856. So there is Alfred Bell's Boomerang Saloon and Gaming Hall that's still in business. It's a legacy of the gold rush from 1849, sort of rough, made of like a log cabin. But what we also see is brick buildings, which are a sign of permanence and stability. And this one here is selling millinery, which refers to women's hats. The Seligman block made of brick. Seligman specializing in women's clothing. So there's more women in town by 1856, more families, more of what you might call civil society. There's also different kinds of mining happening. This is the Pacific Quartz Mill. It belongs to the Placerville Gold Mining Company. And this is a different kind of mining. This is not guys with picks and pans and shovels. This is capital intensive, labor intensive, industrial hard rock mining. So guys aren't working for themselves with picks and pans. They're working for the mining company for a wage for many years in some cases. The Pacific Quartz Mill and the Pacific Quartz Mine operates from 1852 to 1889. And in this mill, they're taking the raw ore that's brought up from a 700-foot mine shaft and crushing it and separating out the gold. And so it's a very sort of new industrial kind of mining, kind of like the hydraulic mining, which involves blasting water into the hillsides and finding gold that way. It's very different from what we find in 1849. The Seligman block back there, it was made of brick, and it was about the only thing that survived a great fire in 1856, which burned down most of Placerville. And so establishing a civil society in Placerville, that means establishing a fire company. The Neptune Hose Company #1 actually was established in 1853. It was mostly ineffective during the big fire of 1856. So in 1857, a year after the fire, the city of Placerville arranges for the purchase of a used fire engine from the city of Sacramento. And it arrives with the name Confidence engraved on it. And they can't get rid of that word confidence. So they just end up renaming the fire company Confidence Engine Company #1, and they build Confidence Hall in 1860. So some of you may have recognized this as Confidence Hall. Later became the City Hall for the city of Placerville. By the late 1850s, the California gold rush, as we know it, has definitely ended. But in 1859, the Comstock silver rush begins in Nevada. And so this is definitely a new chapter in Placerville history. Placerville is very fortunate to be located on the main wagon road between Nevada and Northern California, the Carson Road. You see here that it's got this advantage over Georgetown, Coloma, and Diamond Springs, which is on the old Emigrant Trail, but Placerville's on the wagon road. So it's facilitating much of the travel between San Francisco and Sacramento to the west, and Virginia City and the Comstock Lode and Nevada to the east. All these people that during the California gold rush came to California on this wagon road after 1859, they're going the other direction. They're leaving California and heading to Virginia City. And Placerville is on the receiving end of a lot of that transportation spending. The Carey House is built after the fire, and it's the finest hotel in Placerville, and it does a lot of business as people are passing through town on their way to Virginia City and Nevada. Here we have a street scene near the Carey House in Placerville, California. The Overland stage starts for Folsom. So here it is with the horses there in motion. Everyone's out here. It's a big photo opportunity. It's heading back to Folsom, but carriages and wagons were going in both directions. If the roads were passable, you were going to see a lot of traffic on the Carson Wagon Road through Placerville. It's probably the most significant road in the American West in the 1860s, and probably the most heavily trafficked as well. There is also, we should mention that Placerville becomes a stopover on the Pony Express, which is operated by the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company. It only goes for about a year and a half, from April 1860 to October 1861, but it reduces the time for messages to travel between east and west to 10 days. It's made obsolete by the telegraph, which operates instantly, and that comes in the fall of 1861. So the Pony Express has a short life, but it's romanticized because it's a bunch of young guys carrying mail on horseback and really booking it through the American deserts of Nevada and Utah on their way to Missouri. Let's see. Oh, some advertisements from the 1861 Placerville directory. We've got Wells Fargo and Company Express, the Pioneer Stage Company. Both of these are managed by Theodore Tracy, who's the agent for Wells Fargo and for Pioneer, and he's operating out of an office at the Carey House. So the Carey House is a sort of the central place of this 1860s freighting business that Placerville benefits from, midway between San Francisco and Virginia City. 2 decades later, not a lot of growth in Placerville, but a lot of change. We see another bird's eye view, this from 1888. And what we've got here is the institutions of civil society, the things that are sort of holding society together. We've got churches and schools, and we've also got a railroad. So I'm going to look a little bit closer at some of these images along the margins. This is the railroad. The Southern Pacific arrives in 1888. It had built a branch to Shingle Springs by the late 1860s, but it took them 20 years to decide to bring it all the way to Placerville. And what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the orchards and vineyards that are being planted in and around Placerville. We have this news item from the Daily Alta out of San Francisco. Nearly every foot of the hillsides for miles about Placerville is especially adapted to the cultivation of fruit, particularly peaches, plums, pears, and apples, while many of the south sides will raise excellent apricots and oranges. It is only a question of time when the hillsides of old El Dorado will be covered with trees and vines, and the poor huts of the honest miner will give place for the luxurious homes of thousands of thrifty horticulturists. That is, people with orchards and vineyards. And that came to pass. The Placerville Fruit Growers Association, a co-op of mostly pear farmers in the early 20th century, they organized in 1914 and made pear farming more efficient and profitable. And then that's sort of a forerunner of the Apple Hill Growers Association, which forms in 1964. And of course, Apple Hill contributes so much traffic through Placerville every fall season. But I would argue that this fruit growing that is facilitated by the railroad, and also that Placerville-Carson Wagon Road, which is the forerunner of Highway 50, are and the county seat are the three elements of successful, long-lasting, thriving Placerville, as opposed to Coloma, which sort of became reduced to a ghost town and is now a state historic park. Well, thanks for listening. I hope this is instructive.
Our next speaker is Jill Kearney. She is born and raised in El Dorado County and president of El Dorado County Historical Society, author of Not the Ruling Power, Captain Ingram's Partisan Rangers in California, Heroes and Scoundrels and the Circumstances and Actions Surrounding California's Bullion Bend Stagecoach Robbery of 1864. She is also the author and illustrated of A River Divided, The Story, and docent for El Dorado County Museum and Fountain and Talman Historical Museum based walking tour of Placerville program. She volunteers as a station master for El Dorado Western Railroad Living History program at the El Dorado Depot, and is a watercolor artist and Ford Model T enthusiast.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jill Kearney. I'm with El Dorado County Historical Society, and I'm here to talk about a little bit about Placerville in 1900. What's going on industrially, what's going on with the Lincoln Highway, and what are the notables going on? Who's who and what's going on with that? If I put this on a split screen, I can get a little something other than my face going here. Hold on just a second. And there it is. There. All right. So industrial revolution is what's going on. We have steam power. We have iron and steel and cast iron and things going on. We have mining still going on. And so Placerville, the biggest mine going on right now is the Pacific Mine. Now, the Pacific Mine is pulled out $5 to $8 million worth of gold by 1915. In 1914, Alexander Barron Esquire is an English owner of the mine. He is pulling investors from around the world, including the father of one of our future presidents of America, of the US. John F. Kennedy's dad was an investor in the mine. Who's supporting all this good stuff going on? Well, the machine shops, and particularly the Placerville Foundry, also known as the Morey Foundry. The Morey family is the one operating it. It's a machine shop, and it's repairing and producing parts for steam engines, stamp mills, cast iron parts. We're talking water wheels and pipes, all sorts of things. There's cable systems and steam donkeys going on. And that's about where the Shell gas station is today. Another thing going on, lumber. Lumber is big because we have a railroad to Placerville as of 1888. It's falling in line with all this industry and things. There's the 1900 marks the year that the El Dorado Lumber Company formed and invested its assets into a railway and cableway system across the American River Canyon, bringing lumber from the mill at Pino Grande on the Georgetown Divide side across to Camino and to the railroad and consequently to the world. So this is particularly lucrative after 1906, when that terrible earthquake happened and pretty much ensuing fire wiped out San Francisco. Now, not only are we making frames and window sashes and door sashes, but we're also making crates for packing, because 1900 marks an important turning point for agriculture. Now, agriculture, water sources, all our infrastructure that EID now uses was surveyed and set out in the 1850s for industry of mining, nothing else. Now in 1900, we start to see a shift, and it becomes not just mining, but agriculture, which is needing that water. By 1910, it is neck and neck, and agriculture is pulling more demand for the water than gold mining and mining in general. So we have orchards, vineyards, wheat and hay. Wheat and hay is especially important because we might have steam power for industry, but if you want to get to town and back on a Sunday, your modus operandi is usually chomping on a bunch of hay out there, and you have to saddle up the horse. So that also marks the year that agriculture is going on. The Placerville Fruit Growers Association starts up in 1915, and they become the leaders in cold packing, pears and fruits and veggies and that sort of thing. Now their facility got bigger and bigger into the 1960s. What's left of it now is there at the Marshall Labs up at Broadway. This is the Ivy House. Now it's the Ivy parking lot. Notice here we have a wooden box for Fruit Growers Association. I'd like to mention at this time also the Beech Box Factory. This was up the other end of town, kind of up above and behind where today's Buttercup Pantry is. We're not making cardboard boxes, we're making boxes out of wood, and the Beech Box Factory would make boxes out of box shook wood, and that began also the tremendous importance of our forestry. It is a renewable resource. El Dorado County is was a pioneer in the study of forest genetics and forestry health. So that kind of was another notable about that. And also we had recreation. We were on the road to Tahoe, and who doesn't like to spend a day on the lake up in Tahoe? This picture, I love this picture. Here's a fun-loving group out there on one of the steamers in the Tahoe, with the Tahoe steamer. And obviously by the way they're dressed, they're not Victorian anymore, and they're not flappers. We're talking Edwardian kind of going on here, definitely right before World War I. Changing face of Placerville. If we could hop into a time travel machine and go back and say, okay, at what point in time did that early mining town really start to look like the city we know today as far as the old town? Well, 1910 is when the original courthouse burnt down, and the new one that we know of today was finished, built in 1912. Now, there's a couple of little cannons out front there, and that was, those two were dedicated by the Grand Army of the Republic in 1913. Now, this group of veterans, they got these from the War Department. It was war surplus. The cannons have never seen action. They've never done anything. They were made available to communities at the time, and these veterans got a hold of those two to dedicate here. Now we're talking veterans of the Civil War. So your generation, you still have a generation from the Civil War who are contributing to the community. They're a force. They're a pretty well respected force of individuals here. So if we look at that, let's also look at the bell tower. Now, even though the bell was ordered after the 1856 fires, it didn't get here until after the Civil War and actually got put in place. And there was a series of wooden towers that they were using. So now, 1900, you start to see the change in iron and steel. That tower looks more like what we're familiar with today. It got its electric siren in 1920. Now, the round tent building is exactly the illustration I need to tell you about how the street was widened in 1928. So the round tent building, you see it today and you're like, people are like, why is it called that? It looks square. Well, it was named a round tent store because the original store was a round tent. And when they made it into a brick and mortar store, they made a round facade out of brick and mortar around the front. Well, it jutted out into the street. And that was fine until they widened the street a good 17 feet, whacked that back to quite considerably back. So it's today kind of square. Also the Carey House. People don't know that it was ever anything other than the Carey House. So of course it was built early 1860s as the Carey House. And then in 1915, it was known as a Placerville Hotel. And then 1926, it was known as a Raffles Hotel after another little remodel. And then finally in 1931, it was taken down brick by brick completely so that it could be brought up to state of the art with an elevator shaft in it. And a fourth story was added at that time. And so now that's what we see today. It was then later on called the Carey House again. The Placerville News is really fun because the front facade, again, we're talking the industrial age here, and Shelley Inch owned this building in 1898. Now that's just a couple of years off in 1900, I know, don't hurt me. But he purchased this prefabricated facade for this building, and it's all cast iron and steel. So all this looks really nice, and there's no way that could have held up if it was made out of wood for all these decades. Very nicely done. And a lot of these things were over-engineered at the time because they're still testing out what they could get away with steel-wise and iron. So that's a good one. The Lower Fairchild, first one built in 1903. There was a twin sister to it up the street that was completed in 1913. There's lots of stories about what did they find when they dug out for the new foundation for these buildings. Did they find gold? I won't tell you, but you know. So Lincoln Highway, let's talk about the Lincoln Highway. Now Lincoln Highway is the first marked route across the US. Now, what it really is a patchwork of established wagon roads and trails that typically were well marked through the more populated areas and then back to normal, like the trail that it was in the 1850s, where there's nobody living. So this initially was an endeavor backed by bicycle enthusiasts and rubber manufacturers. And they wanted a good marked trail. And then later on, as more and more people bought automobiles and everybody was buying a Model T Ford, then you had automobile manufacturers start to back it, as well as the tire and the bicyclists. Now, when it comes through Placerville, that's also known as the Overland Trail. And that wasn't even established as a thing wide enough for a stage until 1857. And that's when J.B. Crandall went over and took a Concord stagecoach from Placerville, left here about 2 in the morning, and he went up and went over and through Slippery Ford, over the crest and down into Hope Valley, Nevada, and it only took him 27.5 hours. Now, it seems like that sometimes when I'm coming back from Tahoe on a Sunday night, but I don't think it takes quite that long. It just feels like it. So that then became the Placerville Toll Road. And then later on, now we know it as Highway 50. The route hasn't really changed that much. Generally follows the original route. Didn't bypass Main Street, Placerville until the 1960s. So the main route went right through Placerville. The Lincoln Highway itself, the markers, there's a marker on the wall of the outside of Tortilla Flats downtown that was found in the gutter. It got knocked over, obviously, at some point in time, paved over. And when they discovered it later on, they says, oh, this is cool. And they put that on the side of their building, which is really neat so that everybody can see that. The markers themselves were placed one every mile back in 1928 by the Boy Scouts of America. And again, who was backing that funding-wise was not the government, wasn't the cities, it was tire and automobile manufacturers, bicycle enthusiasts. Really quick, the 1919 convoy, that has to do with the Lincoln Highway. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a young officer in 1919, organizes this 3-mile-long parade. It's got like 300 men and 60 vehicles, and it took them 62 days to get across the United States. Whew. The Lincoln Highway does split. There's 2 ways over the Sierras. One comes through Placerville and the other goes through Auburn. That's because we're talking the Sierra Mountains and things change. You never know what snow is going to be like. All right, notables. Okay, 1900s is an important passing of a generation. James B. Hume, I talk about him. He started off as a miner, and then that wasn't working out for him, so he ended up working for the city. He was responsible for graveling the street. He was really hung up on trying to keep it clean so that the ladies' skirts stayed clean. The ladies loved him for it. He was a dog catcher. He was a tax collector, and then he became a constable and then an undersheriff. During his undersheriff years, he was involved in an investigation of the Bullion Bend robbery, stagecoach robbery. At that point in time, Wells Fargo said, you know, we like this guy. We want him to work for us. So after he was sheriff here of El Dorado County for a couple of terms, and then he decided to go on to other things. And he basically worked completely for Wells Fargo, investigating any and all of their stage robberies until his death in 1904. So there's a system here. If you look at it, your generation who started these camps and stayed to make them cities, they're at the other end of life. They are passing out of power. They're still a force in 1900, but new generation is seeing that they're starting to leave us. So the next example I want to tell you is 1912. John M. Studebaker. John M. Studebaker was here and in 1853, stayed here until 1858. He ended up being a partner with a blacksmith by the name of Hines, and he made wheelbarrows. He was a young man, he made wheelbarrows for the miners. Well, what he did was he ultimately kind of got a nest egg. Striking it rich would mean you got $8,000 basically by all standards. Now, some people, of course, really got struck it rich twice over, but basically, if you got $8,000, you were set for life back then in the day in 1850s. And that's usually if you went back to the farm you started with, and also life expectancy wasn't much beyond 47. So, you know, take those factors into consideration. But generally, by all accounts, he made about a pile of $8,000, and then he went back to Indiana where his family had a wagon business. And that's where he really invested that. And he became the premier wagon builder of the country. And he's one of the few that actually transitioned into making automobiles. So when he comes back to Placerville in 1912, it's in a Studebaker automobile, right? So the cool thing is there's a pamphlet. There was a reporter that rode with Studebaker on his return trip in 1912. Now, Studebaker has a whole entourage of friends that he knows he's never going to see again because he's never out here to Placerville but once every 50 years, looks like. So the reporter is marking down what these men see, how they interact, what they call each other, how they're dressed. It's really this interesting keyhole pictorial imagery that we learn about these guys. And especially when they're in Placerville, they're talking about the old times of Placerville and what's going on. Now, Studebaker on his trip up to Placerville is commenting on the agriculture and the changes that he sees in the valley, the changes he sees in San Francisco and Sacramento and all the cities along the way and towns and how they've grown and how some places haven't at all. So that's really something to look at. He marvels at Placerville and the improvements, but he also sees that his shop is still standing. He tours it and he sees the same tools that he had been working with when he was a young man. There's still a wagon or two outside that need the same kind of repair work that he was familiar with doing. So it's really this transitional time in 1900, 1912, 1918. We're leaving that original generation that started this city, and we're moving on, and they see the differences and they see the changes, and they're responsible for a lot of these changes. They don't look with disdain at their beginnings of Old Hangtown, but they remark at how things have changed and the stories of how they were young in the 1850s and how their experiences made them better and how it changed their lives. So it's not just the growth of these men and their into their becoming adult and aging. They're also part of this town. So it was their town. They're the ones that planted this town, and they're the ones that made it from a mining raucous mining camp into a city. It was the third largest city in the state of California in the 1860s. That's pretty impressive, and it still was holding on to a pretty good significant, hey, we're still here. Even then in 1912. So that's really cool. Another example was the dedication to Frederick Sieg. Now, he had been dead already, but the Druids wanted to dedicate this monument in honor of him. Now, Frederick Sieg came to Placerville and he wanted to was a Druid. He wanted to start a grove of Druids. Now, these were just one of many brotherhoods established at that time. They played an important role for cultural rural enhancement. So when he started his grove, it was the only one that he could get going in California, and it happened to be Placerville too. So there's the monument that everybody has to drive around, but the top, I mean, this was, you know, pretty cool. The monument itself, it has an architect, John Porperato. The flame at the top representing knowledge, dispelling darkness of ignorance and superstition, shining on love of truth, justice, and righteousness. The Druids' main mantra has been that knowledge is power. What a great thought, right? So this was quite the thing. There was a special train from San Francisco with the grand officers in it. They came up to Placerville, they disembarked at one end of town, had a great parade. The mayor was involved, and they all came up, and this dedication was quite the celebration. So lots of cool stories like that were going on at this time. It was an acknowledgement to the generation that started the whole thing of Placerville, and where it came from was Hangtown and moved into Placerville, and how this is something to embrace. Okay, so this is cool. There's lots of research and authors and resources. The El Dorado County Historical Society works with the El Dorado County Historical Museum. There's a research room in there. At this point in time, we still aren't open because of COVID, but if you contact the director, Mary Corey, there's a web page also for information. She's happy to help direct you to resources. A lot of these things are available as books in the Placerville News and also at our county library. The Historical Society has put out like the El Dorado County Pictorial History. This is lots of photographs, an example of some of the ones that are in our archives of the county. If you're more interested in the Nisenan and Miwok Maidu story too, Kopahembo is an awesome figure. He's really a neat guy of transition, that transitional time for him. He almost makes it to 1900. Hidden in the chaparral, Phyllis Gurnis, she's passed on as well, but she did a tremendous amount of research in the Garden Valley area. Placerville then and now, especially for downtown Placerville, old pictures compared with what that place is today. Really cool. George B. Peabody did awesome work on research on so much of the county. Cannot forget to mention him. The I Remember book was also done. Another example of how to capture primary resources before they die, and an oral history, as it is said. And again, that little thing that I told you about, to old Hangtown or bust, has to do with Studebaker coming to town and seeing it one more time before he kicks the bucket in 1912. He didn't kick the bucket in 1912, but you know. And also primary source, again, Pioneers of El Dorado, Charles Elmer Upton tried to do that same thing in 1900. He was making, he was writing down and interviewing people who were involved in great happenstances of the 1850s and 1860s. He was trying to get those primary sources written down firsthand, and that's a really cool book to look at. All these are great resources. Up and Down California, 1860, 1864 is another great resource. Not California in general, but it does cover our area because these are surveyors. They climb Pyramid Peak just in the afternoon just to get a bearing on where they are. All sorts of cool things. Wells Fargo Detective, the biography of James B. Hume. All sorts of good things are out there, and I'm so glad I can share just a little bit of them with you today. Thank you. Goodbye.
Our next speaker is John Clarici, a 40-year resident of Placerville and our former mayor. He currently serves on Recreation and Parks and was recently appointed to the Placerville Economic Advisory Committee. He is self-employed in transportation and water resource planning and management.
Hi there, this is John Clarici, 40-year resident of Placerville. I'm self-employed, consulting in transportation and water resource management. I'm a former member of the Placerville Parks and Recreation Commission, the Placerville Economic Advisory Committee, the City Council, and I had the honor of being the mayor one year. I have been asked to talk about what Placerville is today in 2021. I was asked to describe the current demographics of the city, the benefits and challenges of being the county seat of El Dorado County, some of the major industries that are in Placerville today, and then to conclude with some of the challenges and opportunities that the city is presented with. These are some of the references that I used in developing this slideshow. I got information on the census from the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. They have a census data center there, U.S. Census Bureau. Of course, I went to Wikipedia and looked at the entry for City of Placerville. The Chamber of Commerce provided information, City of Placerville, namely the Chief Financial Officer, El Dorado County, CAO's office, and then I received some additional information from Marshall Medical Center. The population of the city as of the last census was around 10,200 people. The estimated population is just shy of 11,000 people, and that's for 2019. You can see the demographic breakdown of the city. It's mostly white with a relatively large Hispanic Latino population, and then smaller percentages of other folks here in town. Here's some additional interesting information about the city. Obviously, the average age of someone in Placerville is about 38 years. Our median household income is just shy of $60,000, compared to the El Dorado County average of about $83,000. And in El Dorado Hills, it's over $138,000 per household. We're not a very big city. Total area is about 6 square miles. We are the 14th oldest city in California, and we have been the county seat of El Dorado County since 1857. We are home to all levels of government. For the federal government, most notably the United States Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. State government, we have an office for the California Highway Patrol, the Department of Motor Vehicles, and of course the courts are owned by the state of California. As mentioned before, we are the county seat of El Dorado County, which is mostly a benefit to Placerville. There are certainly jobs associated with the county. There are just less than 1,000 jobs in Placerville associated with the county government. These are good jobs. They pay well. They have benefits and a pension program. Because we're the county seat, we also have become the hub for all other levels of government, as I previously said. The courts are here, and so therefore we have that activity as well. People travel here for needed services, so the county provides services besides employment. People travel here for those needed services. So that means, like any attractor, it brings traffic, potential revenue through shopping and return trips. People that live in town, of course, don't have to go very far to access county services. We have a public library here in town because of the county. So in general, having the county seat be here in Placerville is a benefit. There are some negatives. For example, property owned by the county is taken off the county tax rolls. Some of their property is some of the better commercial real estate in town, but those are small things compared to the benefits of having the county services here in Placerville. So what is Placerville today? Well, Placerville today is what Placerville has been almost from the time of the gold rush. It is a working town, providing goods and services in both the public and private sector to a variety of individuals. It is the center of employment, business, and commerce. We punch way above our weight. It is the confluence of highways 50 and 49. It has been at the hub of the spoke of the wheel since the founding of El Dorado County. It is a gateway. Natural wonders and recreation, Lake Tahoe, our forests, everything that makes living in El Dorado County and Placerville worthwhile. Of course, there's Apple Hill, the wineries, the history. Gold was discovered 10 miles from here, and then the world rushed in. And we have been the benefit of all those things. I have always felt, with all deference to the town of Cool, that Placerville, is the coolest place in the world. So before we talk about the town, the industries in town, jobs, what people do when they come here, I thought I'd take a moment to show you some interesting information about the folks who live here in town, myself, my wife, what we do for a living. These are the categories from the 2010 census. They show of the 4,200 or so people that are employed. These are the things that they said they did. At the very top, you see agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, and mining. Construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade. the categories of jobs. If you look down towards the bottom, educational services and healthcare and social assistance, public administration. And what's funny is that most of these people probably don't work in Placerville. They probably leave town and then come back in the afternoon or whenever. But they could do these jobs in Placerville. And that's what's great about this town, is that you can find every one of these employment opportunities inside the city limits of Placerville. My wife, for example, works in healthcare and works at Marshall Medical Center. It's good because it's not a very long commute. So what do folks do when they come to town? As I said before, Placerville is a working town. On any given day, the population can nearly double. So what are they doing when they come to Placerville? On any given day, people come to Placerville to work. Placerville represents about 1/8 of the population of El Dorado County. It represents almost 25% of its jobs. As you see, we have 9,000 jobs here in Placerville. This comes from a report from the Sacramento Area Council of Governments in 2017. The largest employers are Marshall Medical Center, El Dorado County. If you aggregate all the schools, schools are a large employer, and then other governments. But we should not lose sight of the hundreds of other employers here in town who make work for people in construction, manufacturing, retail services, the arts, entertainment, and recreation, and accommodations and food services. Every one of these jobs is important. Every one of them brings someone to Placerville. What else do visitors do? They shop. As you see, the retail sales in fiscal year 2019 and 20 were over $500 million here in town. You can see how that breaks down. Auto and transportation, building and construction lead the way. Restaurants and hotels, food services, drugs and food, consumer goods, business and industry. That is what people do when they come here. That is what they buy. It is important to note, though, that people also come here and purchase things that do not have a sales tax attached to them. They buy services. That could be getting their hair done, their nails done, getting financial advice, legal advice. All of those things are jobs here in town. They are services that are provided, and people come specifically to Placerville to get them because they are here. And whereas sales tax generation is very important if you're running the city, it is not everything about the shopping experience. For example, if you go to Ron Thompson's auto dealerships and you buy a truck, it can cost you $50,000. And that would be one person buying one truck. And although that creates a lot of sales tax, it doesn't create necessarily a lot of activity. But if you go buy a piece of 4x8 T111 at Diamond Pacific, you could buy 939, almost 1,000 pieces of T111 siding. That would be a lot more people creating a lot more activity. There would be a greater presence to that. If you break it down to Tasty Hamburgers on Main Street, you could buy 4,000 Tasty Hamburgers on Main Street. That would be 4,000 people, assuming one person per hamburger. And that would create a lot more activity. So we don't necessarily want to focus just on the sales tax generation, because you could get a whole, well, internet sales, for example. You don't even see those people. They don't even come to town. They generate a lot of sales tax. So we want to be a little careful when we talk about sales tax. But the reality is that's how you fund your city. And this is where people spend their money. So when they spend $1 in Placerville, this is what they're spending it on. So we've seen what folks buy when they come to town. So where do they buy it? There are 3 shopping districts in Placerville. There's the downtown historic area, which is kind of roughly the parking district. It's Main Street from where comes out from underneath the freeway now all the way up to Broadway. And there's Broadway. And then there's the Placerville Drive, Forney Road kind of loop. As you can see, Placerville Drive and Forney Road generates the most sales tax. Of course it does. It's a long road. They sell 2x4s and plywood and Dodge trucks and other things on there. There's a lot of stores that sell a lot of things. Would be considered normal. Broadway has a number of gas stations and a McDonald's and stores on it. And then there's the historic part of the downtown and what they produce in any given year. You see, these are your sales tax generators. Once again, they tend to be stores that sell either very expensive things to a few people or a lot of less expensive things to a lot of people and everything in between. And finally, when people come to Placerville, they come to play. And this is where our historic Main Street takes center stage. The ones that come and stay go downtown. With all due respect to Placerville Drive, no tourists go there to hang out. They come to Main Street. Why? Of course, it's easy answer. The bell tower, the shops, the restaurants, when they're running them, the stagecoach rides. It has this great mix of architectural styles from the Gold Rush days to today. The holiday lights, those are just a few of the things that people come here for. It is a respite from city life, and it is delightful. And if they stay here in town long enough, they may go up to Goldbug Park, or they may go out to the El Dorado Trail. There are so many things to do right here in Placerville. And this has nothing to do with generating sales tax or who employs whom or anything else. This is what makes Placerville a wonderful town to live here. And that's why I've decided to live here for 40 years. Main Street is what brings you back. And some of the key people that come to Placerville don't stay here hardly at all. They are going somewhere else. They may grab a double-double animal style and a tank of gas, and then they go off and do these things that I've listed here. If it's the winter, it's skiing. In the summer, hiking, biking. There's vineyards and wineries everywhere. When I first moved to El Dorado County, there were 2 wineries, and one of them was Boger, and I can't quite remember the name of the other one. I think it was D'Agostini or something like that, down near Fairplay. Now they're everywhere. We have our own appellation. El Dorado County wines are celebrated all over the world. We have whitewater rafting on the American River, the South Fork of the American River. Little known fact, the South Fork of the American River is the second busiest whitewater rafting river next to the Colorado River. All these things, farm to fork experiences. Dining, the gold discovery. Once again, we were where the world rushed to back in 1849 and 1850. But if we didn't have an In-N-Out Burger and we didn't have an Arco, those people would do that somewhere else. So we're happy to have them come to Placerville, even if it's for 10 minutes, and then they can move on. And you know what? They may come back, and then they may visit downtown, or they might go do something else here in Placerville. And that is the great possibility of everything there is. So work, shop, and play. That's what people do when they come to town, and they do it in large numbers. One of the things I was asked to do was describe the industries in town and maybe identify the largest one. From what I've seen, what I've learned, and what I know, the number one industry in Placerville is healthcare, by far. Marshall Medical Center employs the most people. It's non-doctor payroll. The average salary is $60,000. They have good benefits, and they have a pension program. And they are part of a sector of the economy that is growing every year. Behind that would be government. Those are the 2 places where people have jobs. They come here to Placerville to do. They pay well. They have good benefits. Everything else is important too, but those 2 things dominate the landscape. And so if you had to look at it, you'd say, yep, those are the 2 most important industries in this town. To give you an example, the net billing for Marshall Medical in 2018 was almost equal to all of the taxable sales in the city of Placerville. It's a staggering number. And it's a good thing, I think. But as I said before, there is no unimportant job. There is no unimportant sector of the economy here in town. Every one of them adds to the tapestry, to the picture that makes Placerville the coolest place in the world. So finally, let's just talk about the opportunities and challenges. I do a lot of work all over Northern California. Placerville is one of the nicest, best cities that I go to, and I happen to live in. But the opportunities are boundless, as I said. You can read them there. Long short of the opportunities is we're 45 miles from 1 million people in the capital of the 5th largest economy on the planet. Whatever you may think about what goes on in Sacramento, having this proximity to that kind of economic activity is a benefit to Placerville. There's no doubt about it. And then the traffic that goes through here because of that and where we are poised here in El Dorado County, the opportunities are boundless. We have some challenges. There's not enough housing. That's true in Placerville and throughout El Dorado County. We're vulnerable to shifting tastes in consumer spending because we are reliant to run city services on sales tax. And finally, this last thing, thinking of Placerville as one thing. As the topic du jour is sort of brought up, we tend to take camps and think of Placerville as one thing. It's only Marshall Hospital providing jobs, or it's only Placerville Drive doing sales tax, or it's only Main Street bringing tourists into town for the history and the charm of everything. And you know what it is? It's all those things. If we think of Placerville as a working town with all of its bits, I think that is the way to go. I try not to think of it just as one thing. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I hope this is useful to you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Saunders, who holds a Bachelor of Science from Cornell University and a Doctor of Medicine from Howard University. Dr. Saunders is a longtime resident who has been involved in various volunteer organizations and currently serves as an elected county official and commissioner on LAFCO.
Thank you for the introduction. Here's Placerville in 1851. Even after California becomes a state, it will be a long time before cities and towns are formed with elected officials, local law enforcement, and courthouses. Placerville, like many of the other mining camps and towns, will be enforced by miners' law or lynch law. This is a collective of miners assemble. The assembly will come up with rules. These rules will be used to set up rules on the claims, how the stakes will be done, how the number of feet per claim, the laws and rules for abandonment. They will settle any disputes, among other things, and they will also deal with criminal matters. The assembly, when they meet, will act as an ad hoc court. They will decide guilt or innocent, decide the punishment, which can range from floggings to banishment, and in severe crimes like horse theft, robbery, or murder, lynchings. The lynching is the unwritten law, which is what is used to help maintain the lawfulness in these areas, because at the back of your mind is the chance that you could be lynched. Miners' court, however, who could be part of this assembly? So who is eligible to sit and judge and decide? White males, and specifically white Anglican males who spoke English. So if you don't speak English, you will have trouble defending yourself and you will not have representation. The other non-parity is, at this time, it was illegal for many of the ethnicities to be able to testify, be a witness, be a juror, or press charges. So many of the people that this was used against as a tool did not have this as a tool for themselves. This is significant because if an African American's daughter was raped by a white man unless a white person came and testified for them, they had no recourse. At the time, the camps were segregated, so they were still segregated by whites, Negroes, Chinese, and Mexicans and Spanish and foreigners tended to group together as well. This was also in protection for themselves against the unwritten law because they were at the mercy of the assembly. The main threat to the Native Americans, unfortunately, was the land that they held and lived on. This was because of the ideology of manifest destiny, divine right, which led to years of genocide and murder. Prior to 1850, most of California was run by a pseudo-feudal system. Sutter's Fort kind of did the same thing where they used Indian labor. The Indians were gained by kidnapping, food deprivation, slavery, using other tribes to gather them. Tribes that were not cooperative were usually hunted down and murdered. And he paid them in tin currency, which they could only use at the fort to trade for food or clothing. In 1850, when California became a free state, did this change the plight? Unfortunately, no. The speech from the first governor said, the inevitable destiny of the race, speaking of Native Americans, is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. In other words, it was a policy of exterminating Native people in California, and it was basically their destiny. The first law they passed in 1850 was the Act for the Government Protection of Indians, which was anything but. This apprenticeship law allowed white people to take custody of indigenous minors, as well as any adults convicted of a crime, and put them to work without pay. This led to a system of slave raiders that went through Indian villages, kidnapping minors and killing off the adults. In an autobiography from someone in Placerville, this was for a tribe that was coming into at one of the shopkeepers. The shopkeepers took out one of the scales and started taking out raisins one by one. The raisins were measured against gold flakes and nuggets, and they were sold at the rate of the weight in gold for the weight in raisins. They also sold sugar at a cup of sugar per cup of gold. So even those that were favorable ended up being exploited. And another story of an incident when someone was killed in Middletown Camp while the person was in Hangtown. There was a group that was going up to check on the camp. They were going to come back and lynch the storekeeper because he sold arms to the Indians. There also was the governor at the town at the time who made a short speech saying he would take responsibility of raising a company of 100 men at $5 a day to go and whip the Indians. And they gathered 100 men, went to the mountains for months, and came back after the Indians were all killed. This is pretty much the result of the population of Native Americans from all of these raidings and killings. The Chinese, the males were basically brought to America as indentured laborers by American companies. Males came as via debt bondage if they came as individuals, and they were exploited, so it made it difficult to pay back their debtors. Females usually did not come on their own free will. It was usually under the guise of marriage, and on arrival, they found they were not paid for their labor, and many ended up as slaves or sex workers. The first thing also was miners did not want to compete with the foreigners. So in 1850, they also put in a foreign miners tax aimed at the Chinese immigrants. It also affected the Mexican at the time, and it was $20 per month to have a mining claim. The average Chinese worker made $6 per month at the time. As the Chinese became unable to pay and they started piling up in San Francisco from indebtedness, they eventually dropped this down to $3 per month. Unfortunately, this also led to fake tax collectors preying on the Chinese, and if they didn't pay, they were beaten and sometimes even killed. As economic scarcity increased, more animosity went against the Chinese. In Coloma, there was an incident where in 1861, as the valley's placer mines petered out and were abandoned by other miners, Chinese miners took them over. Their patience and frugality allowed them to make a profit from these supposedly exhausted placers. Many resented the success of the Chinese, and in 1861, a riot occurred over the right to mine under an old hotel. A mob of drunken white miners rampaged through Coloma's Chinatown, looting and destroying the buildings. The Chinese were chased away, many were beaten, and several were killed. In another account in Placerville, the Americans called it scratching. The Chinese did not venture to assert equal rights so far as to take up any claim which other miners would think worthwhile to work. But in such places as yielded them $1 or $2 a day, they were allowed to scratch away unmolested. Had they happened to strike a rich lead, they would have been driven off their claim immediately. Mexican and Spanish language, the animosity occurred because it was also the end of the Mexican-American War. The Mexicans were that lived there before, and Californios were trying to get their land back from the U.S. government from under the Mexican government. So they had a commission to claim their land within 2 years. There was a big backlog and delay, and a lot of people lost their claims and lost their lands. And this was also another push where people's lands were taken away through threats of violence and lynching. As we said before, there was the inability to defend yourself or have witnesses, so many were lynched without due process. And the difference is when those that were ethnic were usually lynched, it was usually a spectacle where bodies were mutilated and burned. The eyewitness account from Placerville during the time of the incident where the 5 foreigners robbed someone in Placerville camp. When the miners' camp met and adjudicated, they found them guilty of robbery, and the 5 were punished with 32 lashes. At the end of the sentencing, someone was riding by and claimed that 3 of the 5 men were also wanted for murder in Stanislaus County. The foreigners were unable to speak English. They had a trial in absentia and were found guilty, and they were hung. And this is what happens when you don't have the representation and also can't testify against yourself. So whether it's lawful or not, it is an issue. So African Americans, although it was a free state at the time, it was still full of many slaves at the time. Many masters came and brought their slaves there. They had slaves mining for them. The eyewitness account of Placerville says there was a young southerner in Hangtown at this time. He had brought one of his slaves with him to California. They worked and lived together, master and man, sharing equally the labors and hardships of the mine. And he says, in a town or camp of any of this size, there was always A nigger boarding house, kept of course by a darky for the special accommodation of colored people. But in places where there was no such institution or at wayside houses, when a Negro wanted accommodation, he waited till the company had finished their meal and left the table before he ventured to sit down. So as you can see at this time, even though it was a free state, there was still slavery and still segregation. Andrew Jackson, he was a black miner lynched by a white mob at Negro Hill. It was alleged that he stole $10 a gold specimen. There was no evidence or hint of due process, and he was hung up in full view at the Negro Quarter. And the area of Negro Bar was actually moved to the Mormon Cemetery, and this is the marker that was left. We know in Placerville, we've had many successful African Americans. Nelson Ray, one of the successful black miners, he built a church in Placerville. He was able to maintain enough gold mine to purchase back his children and wife out of slavery. And they settled on the land, which is the post office today. He built a church in the same area, which had an all-black congregation. Another Placerville resident, Elizabeth Thorne Scott, she, when her husband died, moved over to Sacramento with her son. They did not let her son attend the public schools, so she started a private school there, and it was open to Black children, Native American, and Asian American pupils. Nancy and Peter Gooch, they came here on wagon train. Nancy Gooch came with her master. She was able to eventually win her freedom from mining. They were able to purchase their son out of slavery, Andrew Monroe, who came. They lived on a farm in Coloma, which was 80 acres. By the time Andrew and Pearlie were there, they were bought up to 380 acres in Coloma. And we also know the Burgess family was there as well, who were instrumental in building the Episcopal Church. And that was one of the eclectic churches where you had Black residents, Chinese residents, a samurai attending an Episcopal church. So it was a significant history. Japanese, we are well aware of the Wakamatsu tea and silk farm colonists. They came from Japan, and they came together as a colony with carpenters, farmers, mulberry bushes, tea, silk, and unfortunately the colony made it 2 years, but because there was a drought at the time and lack of financing, the venture failed in 2 years. Most of the immigrants returned to Japan. We know the young girl Oki stayed and was adopted by the Veerkamps. Matsunoka Socorro maintained and worked for the Veerkamp family as well. And the samurai Kunosuke Masumitsu, he stayed in Coloma, and he worked as a carpenter, helped build the Coloma Hotel, the Fresno Buddhist Church, and many other buildings in Coloma and the Auburn area, which still stand today. So for the Japanese, we know the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony. There is signs and plaques. There's a plaque for Oki's grave, and there is a sister colony in Japan which comes and visits. Unfortunately for the Chinese, who also were very instrumental in building the Transcontinental Railroad, and specifically in Placerville, they were instrumental in the Sacramento Valley Railroad line, which connected Placerville to Folsom to Sacramento. All that remains for them is the Stone House sign, which is the last Chinese brothel in the area. For African Americans, there's very few, and we know there's been churches and other stuff built, and we don't have that history. In closing, one of the things I will say is that minorities have provided a lot of rich history to Placerville. We don't have a lot that we have to show for it, even aside from the fact of the perception that the logo has for the different minority groups throughout Placerville. It represents a symbol of exclusion rather than inclusion, and is a symbol of a time which represents the fact that a lot of the people that are minorities in this town did not have any legal rights or access to due process. Thank you.
This concludes our Placerville history presentation. Again, we want to thank all the presenters who have graciously donated their time towards this project. I know that Patty and I have each learned new insights about the city's past, and I hope you too have enjoyed learning more about the story of Placerville.